and welcome to Thumbing Through Yesterday, the podcast where we take our favorite books off the shelves, dust them off, and remind ourselves why it is we love them so. I'm Tom Galley, and joining me today we've got Tony Pasculi.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
My pleasure. Now, long-term listeners will remember way back in episode 9, we did a Stephen R. Donaldson book, The Real Story, which was written as a standalone, but it later became the introduction to a 5-book series, The Gap Cycle, which we are going to commence an exploration of today with The Gap into Vision, Forbidden Knowledge.
Yeah, and if you listen to that episode, you'll probably also remember this was Tom's pick and probably my least favorite book that we've read for the podcast so far. So
I was a little surprised you agreed to do this, but yay.
Well, it seemed fair considering I asked you to read Shogun, which is a 1,700-page epic. Yeah,
probably evens out there. Yeah.
But I know that this is a series that really appeals to you, and I was very intrigued by, and I did not know this when we read the first book, that Donaldson had this sort of grand vision in mind. He'd based this on the Ring cycle, Wagner's Ring cycle, and then he had this idea of taking the 3 main characters and cycling through the role of hero, victim, and villain. And that intrigued me as an intellectual exercise, if nothing else. Yeah, so I was curious about what he did with it.
Yeah. Well, I suspect we're going to have a little bit of difficulty in, as we move through this and keeping straight what happens in each book. This series of books is more or less a continuous narrative. So, there's not a huge difference between what happens in book 2 and book 3 in terms of you could almost mix the pages together and pull them apart in different volumes, and it would still work equally well.
I find they have different flavors. Although, so inside baseball here, we read ahead and then we do a couple of episodes at a time. And Tom has read ahead all 4 of the remaining books, and I have only read ahead 2. So Tom's going to have a harder time distinguishing what happens in what book than I am. I think that at least 1, 2, and 3 have fairly distinct flavors. That one is one of those things is that book 1 is very self-contained among the 3 principal characters, and that book 2 is for the first half of the book, and the second half of book 2 really opens up suddenly and very expansively, and the third book blows up the cast of characters to incredible proportions. So they feel like really radically different books to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
In a way, this so book 1 we have. Morn gets broken.
Yes.
Right? Between her gap sickness and encountering Angus Thermopylae, book 1 is, Angus breaks Morn, or Morn gets broken. Book 2 is pretty much Nick gets broken.
Yes.
Yeah.
By Morn. Yeah.
By Morn, yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't really know how to begin tackling this. One of the fascinating things to me, Morn. So when last we saw our heroes in book 1, right? Morn was the broken character. She had escaped the clutches of the most vile human being I've ever come across, the most vile character, Angus Thermopylae, rescued by the swashbuckling, dashing brigand hero pirate of Nick Succorso.
Yes.
Who
turns out to be just as evil and villainous as Angus, with a little bit more outward grace, maybe.
Yeah. He's all reputation but no character.
Yes.
Or the character that's in there is surprisingly, equally reprehensible in different ways.
Yes. Yeah.
So Morn, who was already broken, finds herself at the hand of another abuser, a completely different form of abuse, and yet she discovers power in this.
Yeah.
And this is a Donaldson trope, right? This is Thomas Covenant all over again too. But despite her weakness, now she has a secret, right? She has the zone implant. She has the control to the zone implant. Nobody on board knows that she has this, right? So she can drive herself to superhuman limits, which she does not hesitate to do over and over and over again.
Yeah, I don't know how much you want to get into the detail of this, but what she does, it's pretty, okay. So the issues that I have with the first book, I also have with the second book, and it's just a nonstop rape scene for the first half of the book, it feels like, which is really tough slogging. However much you may appreciate intellectually what Donaldson is trying to do here, it's just grit your teeth and grind your way through. At least for me. I don't know how you.
Well, there's when I read through this series, and again, I've read the series repeated times, there are 2 or 3 points where I ask myself, why am I reading this? Why do I enjoy these books? What is wrong with me that this is appealing to me? But it's a thoroughly unpleasant background that is essential to forge the characters the way he wants them forged.
Yeah. And that's okay. And there's no moral judgment implied here on anybody who does enjoy these books, especially you. I enjoy watching Succession and Yellowstone, which are books or TV series about absolutely reprehensible people, but they are still fascinating people. Yeah. So it's a question of what intrigues you and what you can stomach, I suppose. And I do think it makes a difference. How old were you when you first read these books?
I don't even know. I remember reading the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant in early college. I was introduced to it by a friend there. And I think it was just, Donaldson became one of the names that I really liked, even though, he came out of the gates with the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant.
I know.
That's just not acceptable. But the first one was published in 1990. So honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if I picked it up, at that time, because I was just, for a while I was all about Stephen R. Donaldson.
Yeah.
And there just weren't enough books out there to, as you say, to fill the queue.
Yeah. One of the things I've noticed with myself as I get older is that certain books, I encounter them and I just a lot of the objectionable stuff or problematic stuff just sort of passes by if I read it early enough, and then I go back to it, and either I can then I read it with a sort of rose-colored filter on when I come back to it, which is what I do with Heinlein. I just kind of go, yeah, well, but it's Heinlein, And then others, if it's been a larger gap, like I went back and read Huckleberry Finn, and just like, oh my God, this is really hard. This is really hard to read. Yeah. So I never had that I was never inoculated against these books. So they're hitting me pretty hard now in a time when I think we're really sensitized to violence against women. This is sort of a trope of a lot of fantasy and science fiction for a long time. People just didn't care. It's like, let's use these women as props. And Donaldson here is doing something I think very specific and deliberate with it. I don't think it's cheap. I don't think it's a gimmick, but it's still tough to read. Yeah.
Not going to disagree with you there, because like I say, there are moments, reading through, particularly the first 3 books.
Yeah.
Once we get into the 4th and the 5th book, there's not room for this level of subplot anymore. The characters have evolved. The story has evolved beyond it. But again, we're forging characters in a very specific way, and it's horrible. But for the story for this story to work, it kind of has to happen.
Yeah.
Morn has to be so thoroughly broken that she discovers the unbreakable strength inside her that will carry her through the rest of the story. Angus, well, I don't want to. Clearly we're going to talk about this later down, spoilers, but I don't want to spoil the spoilers for the upcoming things. But what happens to Angus is just, again, morally reprehensible, even though he is quite possibly the most morally reprehensible person ever to person. And watching Nick dissolve under the weight of his own insecurities and Morn's refusal to ultimately surrender. It's a fascinating series of evolutions.
What happens to Angus reminds me a lot of what happens to the protagonist of A Clockwork Orange. Mm-hmm. And it's just like, oh, this is something that should never happen to another human being. But if it had to happen to someone, it should be you. Yeah. So
Angus, what we're talking about, Angus, when, again, at the end of the first book, he's in prison, presumably for life, because of what happened with him. Presumably he was involved in some collusions with Common Mine Security. The United Mining Company's police is able to have a legislative act passed called the Preempt Act, which gives them not only control over human space, but control over all security systems, so security systems on the human settlements, on the space stations. It makes them the ultimate authority, period, in everything human. They call it wrecking. They bring Angus and Milos back to UMCP headquarters, where he is transformed involuntarily into a cyborg, a process they call welding.
I love that terminology, by the way.
They have welding and wetting, right?
Yes.
Wetting is when it's done voluntarily. Welding is when it's forced upon you. And he is he's given many enhancements. He's given supports along his bones and joints, so he's effectively stronger. He's given these phenomenal databases that he doesn't have control over. He's got lasers and jamming fields built under his skin. But
it's kind of a superhero origin story, except that they basically build in a zone implant also.
Multiple zone implants that have complete control of his body. So he is not in control of what he does.
Yeah.
And again, we see some petty revenge being taken out by characters later on. Milos does this to him, forces him to eat his cigarettes.
Yes.
On the voyage, on their secret mission that they get sent out on. But like you said, if it's going to happen to somebody, if anybody had it coming,
Well, I think that's something that I appreciate that Donaldson is doing here. A lot of times, especially in the early days, science fiction fantasy, a lot of it explores sort of power fantasies, and often the hero gets put in a position where they have the ability to take control of someone else, either for saving the world purposes or for pursuing romantic objective purposes, a love potion, for instance, or a charm spell or whatever. And he really kind of takes that idea and just grinds it in your face. It's like, no, this is just not acceptable.
Yeah.
That mind control is straight up evil. Because even when it's happening to Angus, you're just like, oh, this should not be happening.
Hearing his inner torment. It was one of the 3 unforgivable curses in Harry Potter,
Yes.
right? The mind control one.
The mind control curses, but they also still use love potions, willy-nilly. I mean, come on,
Well, there's a lightheartedness to Harry Potter that is completely lacking in Stephen R. Donaldson's universes. Right?
Yeah.
So let's see. I had some things. I mean, we could summarize the plot, but you've read the book, or you're going to read the book, so why bother? This is an epic tale by any stretch of the imagination, and there are a lot of plot lines to it, and a lot of people playing a lot of pieces. It's simply not possible for this to be flawless. So that being said, let's find some things that bother me.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah. Actually, before we get into things that bother you, let's talk about things that you like.
Okay.
Because this is a favorite.
This is indeed a favorite.
That's what we're talking about.
I have read
here.
this entire series several times. Several times through, yeah.
If I get through it once, that'll be it for me.
That'll be, okay, that's fair. Again, it's the scale of this thing is just so grand. And what starts out as such a relatively small story, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a conflict between these two people. You've got a pirate, not a desperado, but a slovenly, legitimately illegal, horrible person being chased by the police. That pairing is the first story that we get.
Yeah.
And by the time we get to the end, we have a conflict that spans, 2 spacefaring empires. We're having to deal with the machinations behind the government of Earth and its possessions. It's grand. It's so far-sighted, you could never look at the beginning and predict what it was going to evolve into.
It is epic. It is very much like an iceberg that is also an onion. It's just like, it's just the tip of a thing with so many layers. To me, that's the most exciting thing that happens in book 2 is that sudden expansion in scope and the introduction of the Amnion, who were kind of fascinating alien race.
Yeah, they barely get referenced in the first book. I think Forbidden Space gets mentioned in kind of a hushed whisper, and that's all we find. Yeah. So and again, as we've discovered, I've got a thing for broken characters, and this is replete with broken characters. There are no unbroken characters in here. And they range from slightly broken to profoundly broken. So I don't know. I love that. I love the fact that despite, in fact, it's built on the fact that the entire premise, and it's a struggle for good at the end. But it's all based on using these incredibly flawed, incredibly bad people in incredibly flawed, incredibly bad ways to do incredibly flawed, incredibly bad things that somehow end up with a positive outcome. So very ends justifies the means.
Where does this book 2, because we're trying to do, book 2 on its own here, which is hard to do, as you point out. It's hard to separate it out of the 5-book cycle. But where does this book stand for you in the cycle? Is it?
Oh, that's a good question. Like you said, there's a lot of that happens in this book that opens up the scope of the story, right? We start to get an idea that this is a much bigger tale. If we didn't know this by the fact that there's a stack of 5 books, right? But we're starting to get a sense that this isn't a limited conflict, between these 3 characters, Nick, Morn, and Angus. But there's more than we thought there could be more, right? Yeah. We're starting to deal with the amnion, right? We make the trip to enablement station in this one, right?
Yes.
I believe so.
Yes.
Right, where her son is born and force grown.
The son, the force grown son. He said this came out of the 90s, and I don't know what the timing of that is relative to Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
91 is when the second book was published.
So that is one of my least favorite plot elements from Buffy and Angel. Is both of those series introduced all of a sudden a brand new teenager out of nowhere. Buffy gets gifted, and they're just these whiny, unfocused, just irritating characters. That's Davies Highland all over the place. He's just oh my God, this character. I hate this character.
Well, he's got a hard road because again, as far as he knows, he is Morn Highland, right?
Yes.
All of his memories, all of his experiences, and he literally wakes up and finds himself in the body of a 16-year-old male in an amnion starship. There's no transition, there's no context, and that unfortunately just doesn't go away. There are some times when listening to his internal drama does get a bit repetitive and tedious.
It really does. And it's, again, you can excuse it. You can say, oh, of course, this is justified. Think of it's so terrible what happened to him. How would you feel if you were in it? But I don't have the patience for that, along with everything else that's happening. And they're just ugh,
but
this character
in a way,
is
he is the ultimate MacGuffin in this book. I mean, he is a very essential part of what drives the plot to its climax.
Interesting.
His very existence.
That makes sense. We don't know... Well, actually, we don't know this in book 2 yet, actually. Yeah, never mind. I was going to skip ahead to a book 3 thing.
Let's see. Other things I love. It's a silly little thing. I love his chapter naming. Book 2 is the last time where he even attempts to put chapter numbers. So in book 1, we had chapter numbers, but some chapters were named. Like if the chapter was about Morn, it was called Morn. Yeah. Right. In book 2, we have some chapter names and some chapter numbers, and then he abandons it. From the rest of the series, it's just names, Morn, Hashi. And my absolute favorite of those is when he needs to write about something that's not a person. It's simply labeled ancillary documentation. We can have, the encyclopedia reading about the gap drive or about the amnion.
I enjoyed those. I'm sort of one of those science fiction fans that doesn't mind a big info dump. It's show me your index notes for your world building. I enjoy that. And it's hard to introduce that smoothly in a narrative. And, I don't like it if it's done clumsily. As you know, Bob, the planetoid we're living on. Yeah, I hate that.
Yeah, but so he just excerpts it from the story and sets it as almost as a sidebar. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So like Asimov did with the excerpts from the Encyclopedia Galactica, or any number of writers have done, usually in smaller chunks. Really enjoyed that. Yeah. So that's fun.
Me too. I had a thought there, but I lost it.
You were talking about chapter names.
Oh, yeah, the chapter names. But one of the things I appreciate this, I don't know if I would label this hard sci-fi, but he tries, right? Because, we have to deal with the fact of G, right? Yeah. And we have ships that have internal spin to replicate G. And he talks about the transitions between internal spin and thrust. Yeah. There's an entire series of combat stories that rely on the limits of light speed sampling and technology. There's a lot of hard-ish sci-fi built into these.
The ship-to-ship combat I found plausible. The on-ship hand-to-hand combat didn't seem to reflect the lack of the low G nearly adequately enough.
Yeah, there's some issues. And again, this is a little thing, but one of the things that does bother me is his ships, rather than having the ships spin, they have an internal core that spins to provide G, at least on the bigger ships. The smaller ones just rely on acceleration. But like the bigger, I might be getting ahead of us by a book. I think I am. Never mind. We'll come back to that.
One of the things I like, and this I'm going to blip ahead briefly to book 3, is the book titles themselves. The real story, the gap into, because it's called the Gap series, but every single book has a different, the gap into whatever, the gap into conflict, the gap into knowledge, the gap into whatever. But the subtitles are The Real Story, Forbidden Knowledge, and book 3, my favorite so far, A Dark and Hungry God Arises. I mean, these are just epic, evocative names. Yeah.
Well, Donaldson has got a gift for naming, whether it's the books, whether it's the chapters, whether it's the characters.
Let's talk about character names.
Okay, go for it.
No, it's my question for you. A lot of the names feel almost meaningful, but not quite. It's like, you must be going for something with a name like Angus Thermopylae, but I don't know what. Thermopylae, of course, the Gates of Fire from the Greek legend of the 300 that stood against the invading Persian army. Angus, a Scottish name. What's going on there?
Yeah, he actually talks about both how Angus Thermopylae and Nick Succorso were just names that occurred to him. And for a long time were just rattling around in his head before he ever wrote the first word to any of these stories. But, I mean, there's no shortage of good, and there's some way in inferential. Orn Vorblood.
Well, how about Morn Highland? The saddest character, and her name is spelled M-O-R-N, but it sure sounds like M-O-U-R-N.
Indeed.
Yeah. And Highland, so she's the sort of moral authority who's in mourning. Warder Dios. I mean, come on, these names are just like, they feel like they're clues to something.
Clues to who they are, you know. And the same thing, I mean, somehow the names fit the characters without it usually being overt. It's just, I don't know, it's something I love about
Is Mark
Donaldson.
Vestibule in book 2 or book 3?
Mark Vestibule is in this one. You do meet Mark Vestibule.
What a name. And it's not spelled like a vestibule, but still, that's what his name is.
And Mark is a partially successful amnion experiment. They're trying to create amnion, transform amnion or humans into amnion, but make them still look and be passable as humans. It's a Terminator plot, yeah. Mark is a partially successful one. And there's a really deep backstory here that we don't get into certainly not in this book.
Not in book 2, no.
It may be book 4 or 5 before that pops up, I'm not sure. Forbidden Space in the Amnion. I mean, wow, does he do a fantastic job of fabricating an alien species?
Yes.
This is not just some bush people that happen to look like bushes but act like people. They are profoundly alien, and the interactions between humankind and the Amnion are fascinating to me every time they happen.
They remind me. It's interesting because they are generally presented from the human POV as straight up evil, and yet when you look at their behavior, especially compared to the human characters, they seem amoral rather than immoral. They're just like following their own best interests, and not nefarious in the way that Nick and Angus and the Bill and some other characters are. Yeah, they remind. Did you ever read the second book to Ender's Game?
Yes.
You did? Okay. So they remind me a lot of the Descolata virus.
Okay.
Yeah. It's like, I'm not evil. I'm just going to destroy everything I touch, but that's just my nature. Yeah.
Yep.
It's not intentional.
Yeah,
it's
and
just business.
The Amnion have a genetic imperative to make everything Amnion.
Yeah.
Not all that different from us in a way,
Yeah.
But they are incapable of lying. They're incapable of deceit. They're incapable of treachery. They are almost Vulcan in their approach to things. But they are letter of the law, So if you make an agreement with them, you really have to be careful about what the agreement is. This is a deal with the devil type of deal. If you miss a detail, well, that's a shame that you missed the detail, but hey, guess what? You're Amnion now.
This actually was a thing that bothered me in book 2. Nick is talking about making deals with the Amnion, and he says over and over and over to the point where they make the deal, that you can trust the Amnion, they're straight shooters, they always keep their word, but then everything he does is he behaves as if they are not trustworthy whatsoever. And it really, I found that jarring. And it turns out, of course, that they're not trustworthy in this particular case. We don't find that out until book 3, I think.
Yeah.
No, we find that out in book 2. They screw them on the gap drive replacement. Yeah.
Well, this is one of the things, this ties to something that really bothers me about this book.
Uh-huh.
All right, so they Captain's Fancy has escaped comm mine. They're damaged.
Yeah.
So they're traveling to the illegal shipyard to get the repairs, and it's a long trip.
Yeah.
But they have to do it the slow way because the gap drive is not reliable.
Yeah.
And then it turns out Morn's pregnant.
Yeah.
And then they kill Morn, and then the computer virus takes over, and Morn saves the day, but she made a bargain, so in saving the day, she gets to keep her son. So Nick uses the gap drive one last time, destroying it in the process to get to enablement station. When he gets there, he bargains to have Morn's baby force-grown and to have a lot of money given to them. They slagged the gap drive getting there. They say repeatedly, we're too deep in amnion space to escape any other way. And yet his initial bargaining doesn't even mention the gap drive. In fact, they complete the bargaining and they're trying to leave when the amnion are like, hey, we would really like that kid back. Oh, and by the way, we know your gap drive's not so good. Maybe we could trade for that.
I think I had the impression that enablement station was sort of in the vicinity of Thanatos Minor.
Thanatos Minor was just on the other side of forbidden space, close enough that they could get there with months of straight acceleration.
Yeah.
But they had to use the gap drive to get to enablement. And they said several times they were lost in amnion space.
Yeah.
They wouldn't be able to escape amnion space without a functioning gap drive. And yet their initial bargaining made no mention whatsoever of, by the way, we do actually want to go home. The amnion screwed them. The amnion were being cheated.
They were being cheated, but they also made a bargain in bad faith, which is one of the things that we've heard over and over again they don't do.
Yeah, and jumping ahead to some really late in the series spoilers, they knew they were being cheated.
Yes.
When they went into this.
I think we get that reveal in book 3.
But it was interesting. So what they did, using the Captain's Fancy to try out these gap components for an unusual result that they knew, that they hoped, I think, would happen.
Yeah.
We end up with Captain's Fancy flying along at 0.9C.
That was fun. That was a fun little incident where their flight officer just panics and slams them out of gap drive just at the perfect time so that as the components are failing, they get rocketed to near relativistic speeds, but not super light. And it's like no ship has ever traveled at that speed before. That's kind of fascinating.
Yep.
Yeah.
That hijinks ensue with that,
Yes.
But again, amnion being the amnion, they're like, if this experiment works, we know where they're going to be. So they send a couple of, and I love this, defensives.
Yeah.
The amnion behemoth-class warship is called a defensive. And again, such delightful names: Tranquil Hegemony, Calm Horizons. These are the names of battle wagons, yeah?
Yeah. There's a lot. So this is, of the 3 books that I've read, this is by far my favorite. And that's despite the fact that the first half of this book feels like a rehash of book 1, with just sort of Nick taking the place of Angus. Like it could have, the first book could have been a chapter in this book. But Donaldson does. I mean, this should be amazing. This should be straight up my alley. This is epic space opera written by a master of the genre, with some incredible hard science stuff in it and some nice borderland stuff, which I really love. You have this idea of the frontier and the forbidden space and sort of those pirate outposts, and it's all really thrilling stuff. And yet, I compare this to a brand new ride at Disneyland. It's like, oh yeah, these incredibly talented Imagineers built this thing, and it's like, it's 3 times the size of any previous ride, and you can't wait to go on it. It's your favorite IP, and they say, oh, just wait, the finishing touch. We're going to cover everything with a thick coat of slime. And it's like, why? Why did you do that? Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
And again, no, there's some slogging, and there's, again, I make no apologies for his use of horrible characters doing awful things to other people and attempting to do awful things to the amnion. But let's see what else I've got here. A little thing. So at the beginning of the book, at the end of the last book, Angus in Bright Beauty does combat with Nick in Captain's Fancy. Right, and the result of that is Bright Beauty gets so damaged that he and Morn are barely able to get back to Comm Mine Station, at which point he is arrested and Morn makes her escape with Nick. But as part of the description of that fight, Angus lands a broadside of matter cannon fire on Captain's Fancy. peels her side open. She's venting atmosphere. That specific detail, which is a pretty big ass detail when you're in a little spaceship pirate frigate thingy, never gets mentioned again. They mention the fact that Angus did damage to the ship. They mention the fact that they've got a gap flutter because of it. But they never again mention the fact that they're missing a section of hull and are venting or have, interior compartments open to the vacuum of space.
That seems significant.
It seems significant, and yet it's never mentioned again.
It's less significant in space than it would be in, say, an airplane. In an airplane, you lose flight worthiness if you lose, like, your roof or something.
Yep.
Spaceship, not so much. I mean,
just don't go to B deck anymore.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
But he could have at least mentioned.
Yeah, it's worth maintaining that continuity.
Because they spent months on that thing, on their slow trip to when they were heading towards Thanatos Mine or towards Billingate.
It's pretty clear as you're reading these books that Donaldson is much more interested in the human story than he is in the epic space opera. The epic space opera is a backdrop for these characters. And in that way, it's a little frustrating for me that the space opera doesn't satisfy because I don't care about these characters.
I'm curious to see if you revisit that opinion when you get through the 5th book.
I mean, it's obviously it's shifting as it goes. So it's opening up and the world building is more expansive. And we see more of it and we peel the onion and reveal the iceberg and all that stuff. But yeah, so far for book 2, there's like some exciting space opera stuff happening. But like, for instance, Morn takes a hero turn. She goes from victim to hero in book 2, right? She suddenly becomes the competent man that I always enjoy in science fiction. She figures a way out of captivity. She turns a spacesuit into an impromptu straitjacket to restrain one of her captors. And she becomes very noble in trying to save her son from the Amnion and saying, I would do it for any of you, her captors. It's like, wow. Yeah. That's great. This is the stuff that heroes are made of. But at this point in the series, I don't believe her when she says that. I think it's sincere. I think Donaldson intends it to be sincere, but I didn't buy it.
It comes out of nowhere.
Yeah,
it comes out of nowhere. Yeah. And one of the first conversations she has with Davies, she says, "You're my son. I love you. You are the second most important thing in the universe to me, but the most important thing is for me not to betray my humanity."
Yeah.
And again, this comes out of nowhere. I don't know what opportunity she would have had to say something like that beforehand, but this blind racial allegiance.
We do know that she's a cop, so presumably there was some motivation for her there. But you're right. We don't. That doesn't get set up by Donaldson because he's so busy setting up the other thing, which he spends so much time on. It's like, could have done with a lot less of that and a lot more of the other. Yeah.
Yeah, and this unfortunately is a Donaldsonism as well. Yeah. Having characters suddenly have a trait that is very significant to the story, but has not been explored before this. Yeah. And we're going to see in the next book. Another thing that he does is have a character suddenly intuit the entire plot of the novel, based on absolutely nothing. But they spin starshine, and suddenly they come up with the actual plot of the actual story.
Yeah. All right. So book 2. Do you have a favorite moment in book 2? So
I don't know.
Favorites.
I mean, that's in my mind, because I've just finished the 5th book, which is the action-packed thrill ride of the series. But, looking back over the synopsis, there's a lot that happens in this book. I think, and this is a god-awful moment, I think that the moment when Nick goes to rape Morn on the bridge and he asks her permission, right? When there's a moment there when we see that what's left of Morn is stronger than all Nick ever was.
Interesting.
It's such a pivotal moment there when you can look at it and go, yep, Nick's done. He's ruined. Although he has staying power.
He does. Oh, he's certainly, yeah. Well, I've only read through book 3, but yeah. Okay, interesting. You mentioned, something you mentioned just now reminded me that there's yet another Morn rapist running around in this book. So first it's Angus, and then it's Nick, and then also one of Nick's officers, who's the data...
Orn Vorblood.
Yeah. Also tries to blackmail Morn into sex, and And Nick, to his credit, I don't want to give him too much credit, just immediately says, "Yeah, okay." He's got a self-destruct mechanism set up on the ship, and he says, "You guys all got to do what I say." And Nick just immediately kills him, and just very decisively, and just bam, no hesitation, no question. Doesn't doubt the man, which is surprising to me because that threat seemed pretty hollow to me, although it did turn out to be true.
Yep.
But doesn't care. Doesn't care whether it's true or not. It's like, you did this, you crossed me, you're dead. Boom. Now I'll figure out how I'm going to survive it.
Yep.
Yeah. Love that decision making there.
Yeah. And again, it's Morn that saves the day.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
She, with the benefit of her supercharger, even though she's not a systems expert, she's not a computer analyst, she manages to figure out how Vorn has put this virus into.
And that was a fun little subplot, that debugging the virus.
Yep.
Yeah. I enjoyed that.
And something I will remember if ever I stationed on a pirate spaceship.
Although, getting back to some ancillary information, the idea of data core is really essential to several plot points in this book. A data core is a memory that cannot be changed or erased, except that Angus finds out how to do it later from the amnion. But he's got a whole chapter on how the evolution from the CMOS chips that we know from the 80s turned into immutable sort of recording devices. And it's like, wow, that wasn't necessary. Two, the technology described is kind of weird because even in the 90s, I think we had DVD-R, which is basically, you want an immutable data structure, take a piece of paper and burn holes in it, which is what, and encase it in plastic. That's what a DVD-R was. Yeah, worm drives. Yeah, so that was a little bit strange.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept. So with the silicon on diamond CMOS chips, right? They only add state, right? You can never change state. You can only add state. So if you were to burn holes in paper, you could go back and burn new holes in the paper to change the underlying data.
You could also erase data. Yeah,
but
yeah.
He spent a lot of time describing technology that I have no reason to believe actually works. I don't know that silicon and diamond have these unique properties that he's describing, but whatever.
But also, you had no reason to doubt it if he just said, this is a mutable data structure. It's like, okay, sure.
And you're right, and it becomes this becomes incredibly important. Incredibly important through the evolution of the series.
Yeah.
This belief.
All right, that's all I got on book 2. Got anything else?
Oh, yeah, the idea of Billingate, Thanatos Minor, and the fact that there's this illicit bootleg ship that's allowed to operate in amnion space because the amnion want it there. And mankind's not willing to do anything about it.
Yeah.
Again, what a wonderful and horrific place this is.
It's a fun storytelling thing. I mean, you can just imagine all kinds of stories set on this space station of just, like where pirates congregate and tales and no one can be trusted. It's like the Old West in space. Yeah. Really, I don't know if you've read any Mike Resnick.
The name sounds very familiar.
He writes a lot, or wrote a lot of books set on the frontier. Like humanity's got this grows, and the closer you get to the core of where humanity started, the more civilized everything is, and sort of the wild and woolly people migrate to the frontier, which is like the borderlands, and he's got a lot of these sort of tales, a lot of saloons set on empty planets, and larger than life characters that get together and swap tall tales, and they're a lot of the same elements of this, but much more fun than Donaldson. Like one of his series is called the Rootin' Tootin'est Gunslinger in the Galaxy.
That sounds very familiar.
Yeah, so we'll do some Resnick at some point.
Cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, when we get to Billingate, we're introduced to Saurus Chatelaine. And again, this is another nail in
Nick Succorso's tragic backstory. Yes.
All right. He's in a hard way there, right? Because he's caught between the Bill, who runs Billingate and who has Davies in his possession, and the Amnion, who will be satisfied by nothing less. And he's got no money because the Amnion have told the Bill not to honor the money they gave him. He's on his way to bargaining out of it. She walks in, and every priority of his suddenly changes. Revenge is the only thing driving him at that moment.
Is that book 2 or book 3?
Oh, you know what? You're right. I'm ahead of book. I am so ahead of book. They barely get to Billingate, right?
Yeah.
In fact, the book ends without them having docked, if I recall. Okay, y'all just forget I mentioned that. We'll take that up in 2 weeks.
All right. See you all in 2 weeks, I guess.
All right.